We're reading today in the Thom Hartmann University Book Club from Threshold, the progressive plan to pull America back from the brink. This is chapter 3, page 53. It's titled Population. Sometime between mid-2007 and mid-2008, China exceeded the United States as the single largest emitter of carbon dioxide, dumping an estimated 7 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere per year in 2008, compared with the U.S. estimated 6.2 billion tons that year. But China is a vast and populous country. On a per-person basis, Americans are still the most profligate producers of carbon dioxide, with the average American in 2008 directly responsible for around 19.4 tons of greenhouse gas, not to mention the portion of China's emissions that went to make products shipped to and consumed by Americans. Russia, with its less than modern industrial infrastructure, comes in second at around 11.8 tons per person. It's a cold country, and few homes are truly winterized. Then the European Union at 8.6 tons per person, and China at 5.1 tons per person. India, which is rapidly industrializing, is still one of the most efficient per-person nations in the world at 1.8 tons of CO2 per person per year. Although that's because much of the country is so poor they don't have cars, the winters don't require much heat except in the extreme north, and the focus of India's industrialization has been digital rather than manufacturing. The largest driver of all these processes that are tearing our planet apart and putting all life at risk is the increase in human biomass. There are roughly 1 trillion pounds of human flesh on the planet right now, and assuming a worldwide average food consumption of around 3 pounds per person, in the U.S. it's almost 5 per day, we're consuming around 7 trillion pounds of food per year. One result of this is that over half of the entire net productive capacity of the planet, the entire planet's ability to produce edible products from photosynthesis, is now used up, displaced, or wiped out by humans, leaving every other life form on Earth to compete for the leftovers. Our population growth has not been particularly even. In the first 100,000 years of human history, we averaged around 20 to 50 million people total. 60,000 or so years ago, as we moved out of Africa and began to cover the world, we crept up to a few hundred million by the time of Christ, 2,000 years ago. Around the time of the Crusades, when the world was, by most definitions, pretty well populated, we were coming into conflict with each other all over the world. There were only 500 million of us on the entire planet. Not long after the American Revolution, we hit our first billion humans on planet Earth in 1800. The second billion didn't take 165,000 years. We doubled our population in just 130 years, hitting 2 billion in 1930, just as the United States was sliding into the Republican Great Depression. But that economic debacle didn't slow the growth of human numbers. By the year JFK was sworn in, just 30 years later, the planet had added another billion humans. The growth in population was driven largely by cheap, abundant oil and fertilizer and pesticides made from it, the farm and transportation equipment fueled by it, and the processing, packaging, and distribution system made possible by oil that lets a person in Iowa have a lunch of tilapia fish grown in ponds in China, lettuce and tomatoes grown in Mexico, wine imported from France, and a fruit cup of berries imported from Chile and strawberries from Nicaragua. In this environment of relatively abundant food, even in the third world, our 4th billion took us only 14 years to add, 1974. Our 5th billion only 13 years, 1987. And our 6th billion only 12 years, 1999. As oil became more expensive, raising the price of food indirectly, since most of us are actually eating oil, population growth first began to slow in the first decade of the 21st century. Part of this was attributable to birth rate declines in developed countries, part to an explosion in the death rates because of TB and AIDS in the third world, part to famine and associated diseases in sub-Saharan Africa as deserts moved south due to global warming. But while growth is slowing, we're still adding people at a rate many times faster than just 3 centuries ago. Topsoil all over the world is vanishing. Transportation is becoming exponentially more expensive. And as human population density increasingly resembles the inside of a petri dish, diseases ranging from TB, more than 1 billion people are infected, and more die from that than any other cause worldwide, to AIDS, to the constantly mutating common cold and related corona and flu viruses, remember SARS, represent a menace that is dramatically amplified by the 1 trillion pounds of human flesh such diseases inhabit. We are not the first culture to reach this threshold of population versus resources. As I discussed at length later in this book, the Maori of New Zealand, a group of Polynesian explorers, are a prime example of a culture that, like the Europeans who discovered America, thought they had found a land of unlimited wealth and food, but ultimately learned that there is a limit to growth, the biosphere, and that when you unthinkingly hit that limit, life can become hellish and democracy nearly impossible. But the concept of a limit to growth, or a finite world, was largely unknown to the classical economists on whose assumptions, formulas, and work our modern economy is organized. In fact, the classical and neoclassical economists, from Malthus to Jean-Baptiste Say to Marx to Friedman, would suggest that the Maori hit the limit not of their biosphere, the ability of the land of New Zealand to produce food, but of their technology. They would correctly point out that today New Zealand houses several million more people than it did when that island nation was entirely populated by Maori. And modern technology has ensured that not only is there enough food, but that surplus agricultural land has been turned to a growing of fuel and medicinal crops. The book is Threshold.